Uh, Good evening, everyone. I welcome you all to another episode of Table Talk, a series of conversations with academics and writers who work on animal human issues in India. We're the Indian Animal Studies Collective. I'm Susan Harris. The Indian Animal Studies Collective aims to bring together academics who are working on animals in India. Today we have with us Balmurli Natrajan, and we are going to discuss his essay on the sacred cow belief. I thought, and before we begin, the talk is going to be recorded and it's going to be up on our website and YouTube, but it's also very short and it's an informal discussion. So feel free to join, ask questions, comment at any point. Please don't wait till the end because we run out of time very quickly. Um, Murli, I thought we could begin the conversation by talking a bit about the sacred cow belief, which you really unpack in your essay. So, for those people who haven't read the essay, do you want to tell us what you're really trying to do with that belief? How do you examine it in the essay?
Sure, Susan, thank you so much. At the outset, I do want to say that I do not think of myself, I've probably not thought of myself as someone who studies animals other than the human species in that sense. Uh, but I'm happy to be invited to participate in this kind of a conversation. I believe it's important for all kinds of folks to engage across our various disciplinary and intellectual silos, one can say. So I'm also happy you've not asked me to summarize the essay. This is an essay that came out, I believe, a year or 2 years ago in a journal, anthropology journal called Current Anthropology, which is an interesting journal because it invites scholars to write on a topic and uh, also invites other scholars to respond, and then the original author can engage. So um, the the title of my piece was, I'm just trying to bring that up, was being vigilant about sacred cows on belief and violence in India. One of the key reasons why I felt the need to write it is, as an anthropologist, one ends up understanding it historically as also part of a long standing disciplinary debate that happened sometimes in the 1960s and 70s about, is there a sacred cow belief? What is a sacred cow belief? And the idea of belief becomes a very important point because in recent times, um, we see the way in which Gaurakshaks have used it, invoked it, and a very wide range of many others have invoked it in order to claim that the cow is sacred, and that it is sacred because Hindus have a belief that is essential to being Hindu, and that is a sacred cow belief. So my essay tackles one small part of all of these claims by trying to see what kind of a belief is a sacred cow belief. And I broadly look at different anthropological as well as agricultural economists who and livestock specialists who had in the 60s argued with anthropologists about this. And the basis of all of that comes down to whether it's rational or irrational, and whether the belief has got some ecological um, functions, maybe even benefits or not. But most importantly, I also look at how the belief itself gets reified, by which we can understand that the genesis or the historical origin of such beliefs gets mystified, and one starts to imagine these beliefs as natural, that is, without history. So, in unpacking that, I conclude through some key anthropologists who are also, one of them at least is a cognitive anthropologist, about viewing beliefs itself as intersubjective commitments to something called the truth, and not just there as a fact in people's heads. And then I see the sacred cow belief then as a reflective, not an intuitive belief. And in this, I draw upon the work of cognitive anthropologist Dan Sperber and many of his colleagues, where then the sacred cow belief is not a belief about a fact, but it is a belief about a representation, and that representation could be about another representation endlessly, or it could be about representations about facts. And this might sound very arcane for many who are not familiar with it, but I felt that it was important for us to actually unpack this to show that anthropologists have long had doubts about whether Hindus have a sacred cow belief, including the doyen of Indian anthropology, Mysore Narsimhaya Srinivas, M.N. Srinivas. And there are ways in which doubts about what we take as given is useful for any society and culture to stay healthy and have some kind of discussions. The entire piece was in a way written simply because of the rise of violence through the Gaurakshaks, and the importance of viewing issues of caste and communalism as part of what shapes our understanding of the cow, the politics of the cow, the religiosity of the cow, and the actions around the cow. So issues of food become very important, as well as issues of rights of people to food. I'll stop there. I've also published few other pieces around the cow, but I've also, along with a colleague of mine, Professor Suraj Jacob, have published on what India eats. So we looked at various databases that are available to actually take a look at what India eats. And the idea that India is a vegetarian nation is fairly clearly questioned in that study. And that study is one among many other studies that have consistently shown that to be the case. But we could revisit any of these at some point. I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that. That's a great introduction. The reason I was interested in your essay is because, as the Indian Animal Studies Collective, there are all these general attitudes and beliefs that not just academics, but people hold about India as a country, and India as a country that has tolerance for animals, for wildlife. And I was thinking that, whether it is the Indian government, so if you look at uh, the website for Project Tiger, whether it's the Indian government or Indian animal rights activists, they will also kind of gesture towards these beliefs or these traditions about uh, living closely with animals, let's say. So, would you distinguish the sacred cow belief as a belief that is used for particular purposes from general cultural inclinations or tolerance towards animals, or the general cultural presence of animals in India in myths, for example, that sometimes when I ask my students in class, they will always say Hindu deities are so close to animals. Animals are so it's a kind of accepted belief in that sense about the cultural presence of animals in India. So, is that similar and open to questioning and doubt, like the sacred cow belief, or would you draw some kind of distinction there?
Um, I would say the following. I would say that we need to distinguish between actual political, ecological contexts of living in which associations with non-human species exist in a wide range of forms, uh, and the representations of these things. So if we consider, okay, there is something about Hindu deities that they're constantly having some kind of animal around them that could be then a symbol itself for that deity. The reason for that is because the deities, um, at some point, if you historicize religion, which I believe we ought to, and religious representations are historicized, they come out of a certain agroecological worldview, world and a worldview, I would say. So the times were different, and so one has to understand then what happens with modernization, with industrialization, with urbanization, with privatization, nuclearization of the family, and so on and so forth. There are different ways in which urban Indians today relate to non-human species than rural Indians. And this is quite a banal observation that is not at all unique to India. And you can then have a way in which you can look at what are the industries, if any, that emerge around particular animals that are viewed as food, or industries around particular animals that are, for example, where I'm here in the US, there are certain industries that have evolved around particular animals as pets. And all of that, in a way, shapes our relationship to non-human species. What I would consistently urge everyone to do, and at least this is what a whole lot of social science scholarship attempts to do, is to resist naturalizing the historical, resist reifying the sociological, or portraying uh, what is actually socially created and therefore requiring social sustaining, uh, social legitimizing, social discourse that actually maintains that, uh, and not mistake that then for something that has just dropped from the sky, i.e., reified, right? So the origins of all of these understandings are to be simultaneously taken into account. I do feel that there is a need for us to understand that even today, many Adivasis, or many agricultural, uh, I mean, people who depend on agriculture for their livelihood, and by that I not only mean farmers and peasants, but also agricultural workers, have probably a different understanding of nature itself and non-human species than someone who's uh, grown up entirely in an urban concrete jungle, maybe a small town even, but definitely metropolis.
And I wanted to ask you about, the sacred cow belief, for example, is also conceptually accessible in the sense that you can define what it is and you can see whether other people believe in it or agree with it and so on. But when it comes to a lot of other, let's say, tribal worldviews or other ecological alternatives that are available in India, there seems to be a conceptual difficulty in theorizing what it is that they believe in or making it accessible to others. So, even if you talk to environmentalists or animal rights activists, a lot of people, if you ask them what it is that they influenced by, theoretically, they always have to fall back on ahimsa, or something like that, or a general tolerance to animals that Indians have always believed in. So what is it about, and in later in your essay you also talk about the non-propositional content of these representative beliefs. So what is it about the sacred cow belief that makes it so theoretically robust for being believed and popularized by some people? And what do you think is the reason for lack of other theories or concepts? Because I'm sure for animals it would be great to have similar theories which are ethically more sound.
There's a lot to unpack in what you're saying, Susan, but let me try and focus in on two issues. One is this thing about tolerance and ahimsa, um, as concepts, but also as claims. And the second is about uh, how beliefs themselves can be evaluated. Uh, and the question you raise about the sacred cow belief being more amenable to that than some others. So on the first part, I think there's a very long and rich set of studies that have been done on the concept of ahimsa, where it comes from. It's a Jain concept, and it really did not catch on for a long time in many other different religious traditions, including Vedic Hinduism at that time. It's a late comer, and it is politically introduced in a way, uh, and side by side, cheek by jowl with a rise in Buddhist um, revolts against large scale animal sacrifices in Vedic times. So much has been written on this. This is there in the Vedic sources itself. Uh, One can see all kinds of ways in which animal sacrifices were very clearly part of the cosmology and the practice of legitimizing royalty and priesthood in the ancient times. So all said and done, then the ideas of tolerance or the concepts of tolerance have to be taken uh, in a kind of a skeptical manner. Uh, who invokes these terms, when, and to what purpose, ought to be a good intellectual exercise that constantly accompanies any of us who studies public discourse. To my mind, and I submit this, I'm not unique again, I'm part of a very large number of scholars, but not only scholars, there are public intellectuals or even um, those those who have got an authoritative voice as public figures, who point to the complexity, the complicatedness, and even the contradictoriness of any and every tradition. So while there are ways in which tolerance uh, um, and ahimsa have been invoked in order to bring peace of some kind, resolve conflicts of some kind, or leave less of a footprint on uh, the ecology. We also have a very long tradition of intolerance and himsa. This is also part of who we are. I don't think it is necessary for us to deny one part in order to understand that we need to work collectively better and deeper on the other. So much for tolerance and ahimsa. This comes into play, just to go to the second part with the sacred cow belief, this comes into play very clearly in a colonial context in modern times in India, when you have the construction of communities, large communities, Hindus and Muslims, and borders, um, imaginary borders really, discursive borders sought to be drawn as to what distinguishes a Hindu in India from a Muslim in India, and immediately food taboos and the cow and the pig become symbols then of community itself. What they hide is, of course, the immense heterogeneity within. All communities are heterogeneous. There's no community, even the smallest one, has got difference within it. That difference, then, when it is sought to be repressed, that's when we have a political discourse of what is essentially uh, this community versus that community. In that sphere, from colonial times, um, the cow has then very clearly sought to be viewed as something sacred. And I go over some of the key events um, in in the article that we've referred to. But others have done a much deeper job of historicizing how the cow came to stand for community. In this case, as an anthropologist, I then keep going back again and again to many criticisms of anthropologists themselves by other anthropologists and sociologists, and in general, a critique of how we understand the human mind. It is very hard for us to actually see a belief. Nobody has seen a belief. That much I can think everyone can agree. We haven't seen a belief the same way that we've seen a car or a tree. Uh, so, how then do we understand that such a belief exists in the mind? Part of the article that I wrote has to do with understanding that social scientists, such as anthropologists, get our data by interviewing people. But there's again a very healthy and rich set of anthropological understandings of how we need to be more suspect about linguistically elicited data. That when someone goes and interviews someone, it is kind of research methods 101, that you don't just accept what that person says, because that person is already thinking, what is it that this person wants me to say? And then maybe they will say it or they'll say something else to throw you off the track. So, how does one evaluate linguistic data from interviews? In everybody's mind, there is always some kind of an active doubt, doubting, an active urge to believe. There's a reflection on the belief. And in fact, most of our beliefs are reflective beliefs, according to Dan Sperber and many other cognitive anthropologists. There are very few what he calls intuitive beliefs. And a reflective belief is one in which one has an attitude towards a proposition, in this case, a commitment to some kind of a truth, and the context of that, that is, who says this? Maybe I believe this because someone else who I respect believes it. Maybe I believe this because everyone else around me believes it and I want to fit into that. Maybe I believe it because my parents told me the opposite to believe, and I am rebelling against my parents, so I'll believe something else. So there are various ways in which one reflects and then arrives at an attitude towards a belief, and that's how difficult belief is to study. There are some anthropologists and others who have rejected the notion of the belief itself as worthless. Let's actually work on some other aspects of the human mind, they say. But beliefs cannot just be set aside simply because they are invoked every time something becomes a political movement. And there are claims that are made as to what is in people's minds and heads, and people act on that, as a result of which such things become very crucial to intervene. And I'll just leave it with this, that animal studies is a fascinating um, uh, set of approaches that very recently have gained a lot of recognition. But as far as the sacred cow belief and things like that go in India, it is very important to recognize the contradictions and tensions between the right to food for a large section of human beings versus the right to live with dignity for animals. And I wish this wasn't in contradiction, but it is. And I'm not saying that it is irresolvable, but it needs some very deep uh, cross-disciplinary understandings that comes not just from scholars, of course, but definitely from um, activists and from ordinary people whose lives in many ways are intertwined with non-human beings. So I look forward to some kind of discussion on that end.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually been one of the most prominent questions in our discussions too. And that leads me to my next kind of meta question that I just want you to comment on, because I understand the social, the material aspects of beliefs, and also the historical aspect of building up a particular belief. But where do you think that leaves us, the ethical question? If we want to talk about ethical attitudes or ethical beliefs that maybe somebody wants to invoke, then is there space for that? Because again, uh, when we have discussed anthropology in the past, one of the problems that we've discussed is that there's a lot of description of what is going on, these complex behaviors. There is a certain belief that a person holds, but then the animal is still sacrificed in the end. So that kind of cultural description, that does not leave us much to talk about what can the ethical be, or is there an ethics in place. So do you think there is space for that within this discussion, or do you think it depends on who's talking about what?
Of, of course, there is always ethics as part of our lives, everybody's lives. Anthropologists have famously gone to places that are deemed to be having no morality and ethics and discovered a very rich understanding of morality as well as ethics. Everything is contextual in that sense. I think I'm just going to push and provoke, and it would be great if anyone else also wishes to speak up on this, because the question of violence underlies the question of ethics. Um, my work has been on caste and to some extent on communalism. Um, and the the issue with the politics around the cow has always also been about the right to food, the right to sources of protein that at least at some point were the cheapest, and the right for people to choose what they want to eat, of course, within certain societal norms. And then in this mix comes the politics of who decides what is food and what is not. Um, what has not happened from the kinds of scholarly traditions that I work out of is an intense discussion with animal studies scholars. That's why I welcome this. Um, but I also wish to underscore that there is a way in which there are uh, pathologies of power at work, to invoke Paul Farmer's famous way of understanding structural violence, that different bodies are actually put at different levels of risk by a way in which society is organized. That is what structural violence is. But Paul Farmer goes further and he says that there's all kinds of sufferings. Some of it is, of course, existential sufferings, but much of it is imposed upon social sufferings, in other words, and that different people suffer in different ways, but the poor, for example, not only are more likely to suffer, but they are also less likely to have their suffering noticed. That is, their suffering is even denied an epistemological status. And we either dismiss it or we pretend it doesn't exist, or it is not allowed to even enter the world of discourse through which we generate meaning and recognition and then finally understanding. So, on this spectrum, I think animal suffering can definitely and must be included. However, it is not an easy thing in India of for you know just applying this in some kind of a mechanical fashion, simply because all food is through culture is also casteized and communalized. There doesn't seem to be any food that escapes this. If it is neither casteized nor communalized, it is at least ethnicized in some way. So if I am Tamil and I enjoy puri bhaji, there is some way in which my Tamilness might be invoked by someone to say, well, puri bhaji is not Tamil food. Why are you eating it if you're Tamil? And I'm just bringing some things up in a kind of a parody, just to say that there are claims to what is a community's food. And then there are claims to what is a national acceptable food. Given this, I feel issues of violence and ethics have a challenging task.
Krishnani, do you want to add something?
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion and also for the very interesting paper. Uh, I wanted to ask, following from your earlier question, I wanted to ask what would be the, especially because you're talking about um, the discursive production of the sacred cow belief. I also wanted to ask what would be the relation between the sacred cow belief and the practices uh, uh, around this belief, or uh, do the practices also produce this belief in a certain way, or do the practices also have a place in the genesis of this belief itself, or is it mostly just? I also understand that practices are a part of the discourse itself. But I also wanted to ask what would be the relation or what would be the transaction between the discourse and the practice, the discourse of the sacred cow belief, and also the practices that both practices in two ways. One being the practices that people do, uh, that people perform with regard to cow reverence, etc., and also the practices that of the industry itself, of, for example, the dairy industry or the the slaughter industry, the practices around the cows themselves. So, what would be the relation between how the practices also feed into this discursive belief in that way? This is basically coming from my other question, which is about how can we, or is there at all a method that is possible within your framework where we can also look at how the sacred cow belief is interacting with the cows themselves as well, which also seems to be in a very simplistic fashion, also seems to be the preoccupation of an animal studies discipline as well.
All right. So, thank you so much. Let me actually go to my article and read out a line from M.N. Srinivas, the doyen of Indian anthropology, and he wrote the following in 1962. It is commonly believed that the peasant's religious attitude to cattle comes in the way of the disposal of useless cattle. Here again, my experience of Rampura makes me skeptical of the general belief. I am not denying that cattle are regarded as in some sense sacred, but I doubt whether the belief is as powerful as it is claimed to be. While the peasant does not want to kill the cow or bull himself, he does not seem to mind very much if someone else does the dirty job out of his sight. So I'm bringing that up as a way to say that what is the relationship between beliefs and practices? As I said before, it's very hard to determine whether beliefs exist. Any belief. One has got an immense amount of advances in science that have discerned the mind and various ways in which the architecture of the mind has space not only for concepts but for connectivities. So, um, connections, synergies, and things like that. These are how we understand how the mind, in a way, conceptualizes and represents in the mind. So we can have some kind of a perception that is not just an external stimuli, but it's some kind of a trace in the brain. But it's not very easy to point out there is a belief. So the connection between a belief and practice then has to be seen in some kind of a dialectic fashion, in the sense that many times a practice might seem to be publicly justified by claiming it derives from a belief, in which case then the belief gets constructed but not necessarily lodged in the mind. It's actually lodged maybe partially in the mind when one starts believing one's own representations of beliefs. But it is definitely lodged in the public domain through signs and symbols and narratives and repeated invocations by political actors. Many times, practices, just as Srinivas's observation, which by the way is non controversial. Pretty much everybody could probably understand and accept that that's happening all the time. Um, that is, practices may be at variance to something called a belief, and people may do all kinds of things that contradicts that, maybe even sometimes in open contradiction, but many times it happens more subtly. It happens in subversive ways. In that sense, I would think of a belief initially, approximately, as some kind of a norm. Um, that is, it's a generalized expectation that has consistently been constructed by powerful and elite classes of any society. So the culture of our times, of historic time, is also the culture of the dominant classes. And I'm using classes very broadly. It's not just an economic thing. It includes castes, it includes gender, it includes various ways in which you can say there are sets of people with power, mathematical sets, you can even think of that. In that sense, one, one has to have some way of privileging practice, um, at least for methodological reasons, that we can see practices, and by that I mean repeated um, collective ways of doing some things, not just idiosyncratic one-off behaviors. Right? We can see practices, and from there we build certain ways of understanding why those practices happen. At some point, we may take recourse to, well, there are things in people's minds, which is correct. We do act with our minds, but we are motivated by very different types of urges, including we are seeped with doubt. And many times, public culture tells us, well, on certain things, don't doubt. And don't raise your doubts, more importantly. Don't be skeptical. Don't question. And accept it as a given. Scholarship has to push back on that. The acceptance of a given, once scholars start accepting things just as a given, then one can just close shop and finish scholarship. We don't need scholarship anymore. Hopefully, I'm able to engage a little bit with what Krishna Nuni has raised.
Yes, yes, absolutely, sir. Just as a follow-up, so I work on captive elephants and how captive elephants are looked at as sacred animals in the context of Kerala, and at the same time, how this particular belief interacts with extremely violent use of these animals in temple festivals, especially. So, if I can take the liberty of giving just one example of an elephant called Guruvayur Mukundan, who is owned by the Guruvayur Krishna temple, and he was a very rebellious elephant from the time of his acquisition, and he killed two of his mahouts. At which point, I, in some process of his training or of his taming, his one of his legs was crippled, and there was no change in this. It was unchangeably or irretrievably crippled in that way. And this is something that is said in an AWBI, Animal Welfare Board of India report on the Guruvayur elephants. And at the same time, if you're looking at other discourses around these elephants, especially elephant fan pages, which is also a thing in Kerala, this elephant is said to have stood up after lying down in a very sudden fashion, and because of that, the leg bent in a certain way, and it could not be, made correct after that. So I'm trying to see this through the doubt framework that you talked about, where uh, considering the structures of violence that is there around the elephant, one seems to, or one is pushed to relying on this belief that the crippleness of the elephant was a product of his torture in that sense. But at the same time, whether the elephants are suffering is cast into doubt by certain other structures, which again use this particular doubt in order to push the other interpretation that it was not really a product of torture. Instead, the elephant stood up very suddenly and then therefore bent its leg irretrievably. I'm just a little concerned about doubt and multiple interpretations having a counterproductive or somehow blurring the larger aim that we have, which is to uh, be able to articulate the violence that people and animals face, and and highlight the forces that disarticulate this violence. So, does doubt and skepticism and a plurality of interpretations also have this counter effect, or this particular counterproductive effect of also, taking the carpet under our feet when we are trying to argue for articulating the violence that people face?
It's a fascinating question, Krishna Nuni, and I cannot claim to be able to give any thorough response to that. I would only point to some way in which we can maybe realize that, let's take something like suffering. How do we convince others that suffering uh, exists in a particular case, right? Uh, at some point, one can say, well, there is a hierarchy of suffering. We should not even give in to that, but we can at least say that even if there's a hierarchy of suffering, one is not denying that suffering happens. But there is no way around plurality of narratives. Um, Reality, in some ways, is constituted through representation, but that does not mean that there is no reality outside of representation. It's just that we are unable to comprehend it, cognize it, capture it without representations. And this is the way in which, for example, Stuart Hall and the cultural studies program has consistently avoided a radical postmodernist denial of reality outside of discourse by saying there is an objective world out there, i.e., the world is not just created from our heads. However, in order to cognize it, one can't escape representations. Um, I don't know exactly how to work through some of the interesting the case you talked about. Maybe we could do that offline, um, just to see um, if the idea is to then invoke the sacred in order to fix some kind of a truth, um, that act itself is subject to further critique, and it cannot be otherwise in that sense. Uh, it also prompts me to say one more thing, if I can, Susan. Uh, I teach at a very working class university in the US. My students are mainly first generation college going students. They are black and brown as well as white, and most of them work. But from time to time, when we talk about food, then the the tired student who works 20 to 30 hours a week and then comes and sits in my class wakes up, and one of the things that I have fun in provoking is about food taboos and about the way in which the dog dogs are not eaten in the United States, neither are horses. And there's a literature and anthropology also about these kinds of things. But I bring this up about why is it that Americans, North Americans, US Americans don't eat dog or horse? There is no invocation of the sacred. Instead, you have a social history that actually can be combined with a uh, analysis, a symbolic analysis even, about how, for example, the political economy of the pork industry or the beef industry at some point got a head start over what may have been a possible dog meat industry. And that is part of the equation. The other part is how a history of um, seeing eye dogs for those who were actually rendered blind due to certain um, hospital errors, and that in some way is also part of the Americans with Disabilities Act and things like that. And so dogs as pets started acquiring a certain social status, and then they are also as pets uh, named and then allowed to come into spaces where no other animal would be allowed to come, including people's beds or licking them and things like that, and having a kind of a symbolic prestige that other animals don't have. So I'm just bringing this up as a way that we could address some of these issues without invoking the sacred. In India, that has unfortunately, in my opinion, produced a very, very different and much more intractable uh, kind of a politics around food. My students, by the way, are surprised and stunned to hear about some of these things. Then we go into the history of taboos in other cultures and things like that.
Thank you very much, Balmurli. These are very useful directions to think about the problem. There's one final question could you also speak about how do disruptions figure in the sacred cow belief? I'm thinking of beef festivals that are organized as resistance to the Hindutva, propaganda on considering the cow as a sacred animal and as a sacred mother. How do we make sense of disruptions to this belief as well? Are they recuperated by the larger belief, or do they stay on as disruptions or other ways?
Surely, I can say something about that because I've also written on beef festivals. But would it be okay to maybe hear a few other voices? Then we'll come back to Krishnanuni's last question.
Yeah, Parth, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi, am I audible? Okay. First of all, thank you so much for your talk and your article. It provides a lot of food for thought. My question is also kind of adjacent to what Krishanuni asked. And Krishanuni, your research sounds very fascinating. I'm also eager to learn more on your work on elephants. So my question is especially, and you talked about it during the initial part of your talk, is that is there any scholarship or is there any way of like saying a care ethic within Dalit thought which takes into consideration the non-human? Like, can we think of an ethics of animal ethics that is coming from a Dalit discourse? Because I mainly work in cinema and like I'm writing a paper currently on the presence of animals within like contemporary Dalit cinema. I'm writing a Perimapurumal and how the dog eventually figures as like a symbol of Dalit resistance and Dalit solidarity. So I was just curious about this, whether we can approach the question of animal ethics from a Dalit point of view. Just curious to hear about that. And thank you so much.
Should I just take both of these together? In a way, you can. Um, so very quickly, I think I wrote maybe two other articles, and several authors have written on the beef festivals as acts of resistance, and including leading scholars like Gopal Guru have written much earlier on the politics of food and caste and things like that. Uh, the only thing I would say, and if any of you wishes to have access to the articles that I wrote on the beef festivals, please write an email to me. But it's also available, I believe, on Google Scholar or on my website too. Um, One of the things is, yes, of course, these are disruptions that are very clearly propelled by oppression and repression, and um, they are also evoking uh, some very wide range of possible ways to resist, but also to assert a different way of thinking and being. Uh, so my article goes through some of those, but it also talks about the limits of beef festivals, and it also issues certain cautionary notes about how, if I can remember it correctly, about how the beef bans um, are caste battles on cultural grounds, but not cultural battles on caste grounds. And I try to unpack what I mean by that, because I feel that there is a way in which one can make certain kinds of uh, acts of resistance without necessarily reifying and um, culturalizing or making essentialist claims about who is a Dalit and what is Dalit food. So I think those are some kind of sympathetic cautionary notes. As far as digging deeper into Dalit traditions, Parth, of course, uh, 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 one has to do it, and probably one will come up with ways in which one can see these kinds of things. I'm afraid that I'm not having anything at the top of my head to kind of point you in any directions, but maybe we could do this offline, and I could put you in touch with others who are probably um, working already on such things or have written more on that. But it is I think a worthy pursuit. But I would say it is not a given either. There are all kinds of funny things that come up once we start researching certain topics.
Yeah, thank you so much. What is the name of the article that you mentioned that you wrote on beef festivals? But it's available on your website, so I can also get it from
Yeah,
that. But
yeah,
thank you
yeah,
so much.
yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on what you said about suffering, and was thinking about Urni's question and on what Veena Das has written about pain and so on. And in your essay, what I found the fascinating dimension of it is that you talk about how anthropologists have talked about belief and how sometimes they make the mistake of thinking that there is a belief when there isn't one. And so I was thinking about how can we really talk about the ethical, especially when it comes to non-human suffering, because it seems to me that the anthropologist or the social scientist has to kind of come to the paper with their belief that uh, the poorest of the poor humans suffering is untold, and so there is that human ethical imperative that every academic kind of feels to talk about human suffering uh, when they have been unaddressed, so to speak. So then that kind of makes questions, including livelihood and food, difficult to address, because then, as the academic kind of describes what's happening, the human suffering kind of takes the it comes to the front, and non-human suffering kind of fades out. So then what would the method then be? What should we start with the ethical? Because it feels like if we are to keep both, if we try to be fair about it, then the non-human will kind of stay as the symbol, um, feel like just a symbol when there are actually real animals.
In a way, Susan, that's the biggest question that I'm afraid I can only say the following. I think um, scale of societies becomes a crucial dimension of how we approach this. Let us assume that we want to develop a methodology, if I'm hearing you right, develop a methodology which doesn't a priori prioritize or privilege or valorize human suffering over animal suffering. Let us assume that that is where we want to go. To my mind, small scale societies, which is part of the anthropological disciplinary output for a very long time, small scale societies have in many ways been shown to have a much better, if not anything, I mean, they're nowhere near perfect, nobody is, right? There's a lot of romance of the small scale too, one has to be cautious about, but there's a way in which small scale societies have had a better way of achieving some kind of an ecological balance between humans and non-humans who they share the same agro-eco space. But once scale sets in, once you start having a industrial scale, now even post-industrial scale, the questions obviously change. And so I think there are small steps that are in some ways been taken, and that is distinguishing between um, industrially produced meat versus non-industrially produced, small scale, locally sustainable form of meat. That to me is a small step towards acknowledging the unacknowledged, the kind of pathologies of power that Paul Farmer talks about, in which animal suffering is just shut out uh, when when people are able to just go and pick meat at the market. Um, the thing about India is anyone who has eaten meat knows that one has to go to a marketplace where probably the chicken at least is butchered in front of you, and then there's a certain kind of a non-alienation, one can say, but nevertheless a very complicated set of emotional and mental representations that one has to go through in order to actually buy meat. Of course, anyone who has paid attention to industrialization of meat, including industrialization of dairy, does uh, very clearly catalog the amount of suffering that exists. I do not know how and when and who, most importantly, can determine whether um, not having access to high protein meat sources in India, which the poor depend on. Um I mean, who gets to determine that, and on what grounds? Um, to my mind, we therefore come to a kind of a stop, and there are two paths. One is animal studies, one is everybody else studying caste-based, communal-based, cultural-based, the politics of food and consumption and what constitutes food, right? Um, but I can only say that maybe we should put our heads together in a little bit better way. And I, for one, will ask questions of, how, for example, does one feed large populations that suffer severe malnourishment? That should be part of the questions on the table. Um, can organic, small scale, uh, vegetarian, or even vegan diets actually feed the planet? And I wouldn't dismiss it one way or another, because we also know that the climate costs, ecological costs, apart from the suffering costs, are also immense in the kind of lifestyles we have increasingly taken for granted.
Our time is up, but I just want to ask one more question, and it's about an animal who's not addressed in your essay. It's about the street dog, who is, also associated with India, an animal you can see everywhere, but does not have the long history that the cow does, and in some sense the questions of class again, if animal rights activists talk about the street dog, and the street dog is an important subject for animal rights activism in India, then again, they're accused of being from a particular class and being blind to the realities. So again, it seems to me that there is some kind of belief, or I don't know if tolerance is the word, about street dogs in the country, that perhaps could be utilized by animal rights activism? Or do you think the same forces could be at play, or is the dog an anomaly in that sense?
Well, I mean, I think the dog is a little different from the cow in that sense, although there are populations that do consume dog meat. And I think the ability of the street dog to be at some point transformed into a pet dog also exists in a way that distinguishes it, I think, from many other animals. I'm not certain at all how to answer your question, Susan. That's, I mean, I would love to participate in more such discussions, partly to learn, but also to see how maybe to better intervene and come up with ways to think about these very different things. The dog has been domesticated for a long while, though, and so there are archaeological evidences about the dogs. I mean, hunting dogs, for example, being a very old archaeological thing, and representations of the dog exist even in things like the Mahabharata. And I mean, Yama had two dogs, and uh, Yudhishthira made a lonely um, journey to to heavens or something like that, and there was one dog, which is actually Yama in the form of a dog accompanying him. And so there are ways in which the dog does have some kind of a status that can be tapped into. But as I said before, none of these have been sacralized in the way the cow has been, and that too in very recent times. Norman Brown's essay that I reference is a very well known Sanskritist. He has uh, gone into how the uh, making sacred of the cow begins at a very late stage in Vedic India, not before that. And it's also the cow of the Brahmin seen as a property. So it's not all cows either. Certain people's cows.
All right. Thank you so much for spending this 1 hour with us. It's such a great essay, and it's great to talk to you about it. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.